Okay. This one might be just a little gritty to get into it with you, but I'm kind of curious on it. Um, so how does stimulus, fatigue, recovery, adaptation, how does that process work with aerobics comparatively to like resistance training? Like maybe if you talk on your side of things, kind of what's going on there. Like I know for us, it's pretty obvious when we have a stimulus, there's some things that we can measure or proxies for stimulus, and then we know kind of when we've overshot it. We know kind of how adaptation occurs, but like what are some of those things, those roadmaps, those mile markers that you're looking for to know that you've done a good stimulus, that you've made something happen, um, and the adaptation's going to occur?
Yeah, it's pretty hard with endurance training because the process of it is so much slower than resistance training. So it's like we might not know whether what we're doing is correct for like months. Whereas for you in your world, I feel it happens much more quickly, right? Like you can tell in a couple of weeks whether or not like somebody is hypertrophying or getting stronger. Um,
You have like leading indicators like getting stronger for reps.
mhm.
So like there's some things, but even then, like it's not necessarily cut and dry, especially if they're newer or if it's a remotely new exercise. So there's like the learning component of it too. So there's a lot of stuff that muddies the water. I would say at like the 8 week mark, it becomes really obvious. But
Yeah. Yeah, so for like the main things that I look for are like some subjective things, right? Like how does it feel? Does it feel any easier? But then also objective things like is your heart rate lower for a given pace? Right? So like if you're running at 9 minute pace and your heart rate's at 150 this week, next week you're running at 9 minute pace, your heart rate should be at 148 or
oh, it's that
something.
that's that quick.
Well, no, that was just an example. It definitely
Okay.
doesn't happen that fast, but like in a few weeks, months, whatever, you're looking at heart rate response.
No, that
And it's different for every athlete, right? Like some athletes respond a lot more quickly than others. Um, but it's more of just like the overall trend over the course of the season as opposed to, you know, I'm looking at this over the course of a couple of weeks or like a certain training block. And so yeah, it is pretty tough to monitor that stimulus that we're applying to then see the responses to that stimulus because it does take a while for like your stroke volume to increase or your cardiac output to increase. And so it's like I'm not and I can't really measure stroke volume or cardiac output in my athletes either, right? Like it's not it's not really a feasible thing that I can do.
make it work.
Unfortunately, it would be nice if I could, because then I could give my athletes objective data and go, hey, look, your stroke volume is a third or 33% higher than it was when we started.
Well, is that
But
is that not though? Is that not pretty objective data? Like when you get your same
well, the
pace,
heart
you
rate,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Because I mean, we
yeah.
don't even have like direct stuff on muscle growth either. But like, if you've gained like a half pound a week on average, and your rep strength over the course of 3 months, like you went from benching 225 for 10 to now you're benching like 245 for like 15 or something like that. Like skeletal muscle occurred,
Right.
for sure. So like we're not doing like muscle biopsies, but I
Yeah.
never thought about just measuring the heart rate. That's smart.
And it's really like one of the easiest things that you can do. So measuring heart rate and um, if you don't have a lactate, because you can measure lactate pretty easily, there lactate analyzers available for relatively inexpensive. It's like $300 for an analyzer and some strips that you can measure lactate at different intensities. But instead of measuring lactate, you could also just do like the talk test. So the talk test is where you're running or riding or swimming. Maybe not swimming. That's a bad example. You can't really talk while you're swimming. Doing an aerobic exercise where you can talk. If you're able to talk in complete sentences without running out of breath, then you're below your lactate threshold. And if you're kind of like breathing heavily and only able to get out a few words at a time, that means that you're going to be above your lactate threshold. So, or relatively. And so you could even just kind of monitor your athletes' ability to speak during a run. So like instead of measuring heart rate, let's say they don't have a heart rate monitor, you're running at 9 minute pace this week and you're running with a friend and you have trouble holding a full conversation, and then in a few weeks you're able to hold a full conversation with them. So just some really easy and kind of quick ways to check to see if that stimulus is working.
So that's interesting. So just to really quickly kind of go over that stimulus recovery, fatigue recovery, adaptation. Essentially, like you do a stimulus, and that's going to drop you below your performance baseline. So like whether
Yep.
that be running or lifting. So for a temporary period of time, you're going to be below that x-axis. You're going to be worse. And ideally, you recover, come back up to that x-axis, and now you can match your performance. And ideally, the adaptation occurs after that, where you get a little bit better, and that's the whole point of fitness, right?
Right.
So um, it's pretty obvious on our side of things with resistance training, if you've kind of overshot that. Like the most obvious one that you look for is like if you have overlapping soreness, you know that your stimulus is probably too high in some capacity, whether that be volume, intensity, because you're looking for like not much more than 2 days, and especially not overlapping to your second session that you're hitting a muscle group, because we know you want to hit muscle groups at least twice a week. What do you how do you know if you've overshot it?
Yeah, soreness can be one indicator. I think the higher the intensity you do, the sorer, more sore,
Or sorry.
more sore you're going to be with more intensity. So uh, soreness can be an indicator. Um, but yeah, more so it's like just kind of how you're feeling, and like, are you feeling run down? Do you have enough energy? And it's a little harder to like go, oh yeah, maybe we shouldn't do this today because, like you said, if you're still sore, if you have overlapping soreness, then yeah, we're either intensity or volume's too high. Um, but yeah, that's like with endurance training, the signs and symptoms of overtraining or burnout, as it used to be called, they're really like non-specific. So it's just kind of like, okay, well, are we doing too much, or is it just
I had a
a
bad night of
little
sleep.
sore? Yeah.
Okay, so then we're gonna go down the rabbit hole in this one. There's a concept called maximum adaptive volume, which in strength and hypertrophy terms is essentially the amount of volume and intensity that would grow you the most muscle or give you the most strength increase at any one time. And how you can kind of subjectively measure that, or one of the ways you can, is through muscle pumps, disruption, like that jello-y feeling in the muscle, and
Mhm.
soreness. So I have a lot of clients kind of subjectively rate it. And I know like if we're getting in like a 7 out of 10, like stiff muscle pump feeling, and like the jello arms is like, I could do a little bit more, but like holding a cup of coffee is kind of hard. So like again, a 7 out of 10, and then you're getting like a good 2 days of soreness. We know that your proxies for stimulus are very high, and you're probably pretty close to that floating window of optimal. Well, after you've completed that, you're going to start to become a little bit resistant to the growth stimulus. It's called adaptive resistance. So what you have to do is essentially give yourself more volume, either mathematically or by adding sets. That's a different conversation, because your body doesn't want to adapt anymore. So you have to give yourself a little bit more of a stimulus, and you're kind of chasing that floating window and using the proxy measures of pump, disruption, soreness to know that you're in that optimal range. So I guess the next question I have for you is, how do you know if you're not overtraining, but you're doing it to such a high degree that like recovery to some degree is inhibited a little bit? Like you're still progressing, but if you would back off just a smidge, you'd actually do better. Or in the same question on the opposite side, if you upped it just a smidge, you would do better. How do you know that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's more so something that I just like try to communicate with my athletes and like, hey, tell me how you're feeling. How is your sleep? Like, is your sleep being disrupted? How is your hunger, your appetite? Are you, you know, fatigued and tired throughout the day? So it's more something that I kind of rely on my athletes to communicate with me than it is something that I am asking them questions like you said, like what's your pump score or things like that. And I guess it's something that I could ask my athletes, but I find that with 20 plus athletes, for me to reach out to every one of them every day is not really feasible. I kind of rely on them to tell me like when is something not
Yeah.
feeling right, or because then it's like, okay, now we can get ahead of it. I assume, for better or worse, if they're not telling me anything,
Hmm.
then things are going okay and they're not feeling any of these side effects or symptoms that would prevent them from having a good workout. So yeah, I more so just like, let me know when you're feeling run down or you're not sleeping well, or whatever it might be that might lead to a decrease in performance, than me actively monitoring. Because like, yeah, we don't really have, it's not like you can feel your muscles get bigger and tight and like it's hard to hold a cup of coffee. Like, yeah, after you run hills, your legs are probably going to be sore and it's probably going to be hard to go downstairs, but like that's a normal response.
Yeah. That's also a
And
small
so it's
part of
like,
aerobic fitness too.
yeah, and so it's more of like a nuanced thing where it's like, okay, are your legs sore because you ran hills and they're sore to go downstairs? Is that a normal soreness or is it an abnormal soreness? And that's where I really try to preach to my athletes about being in tune with your body so that you can tell, like, okay, yeah, this is a normal soreness or this is not a normal soreness. And I think being able to identify that is a really important and learned skill that one develops over time. So yeah, that's kind of how I approach it, is just having my athletes tell me when something doesn't feel right.
Yeah. Side question. So do you do like weekly check-ins with your athletes, and then other than that, throughout the week you let them message you when stuff's wrong? Or is like what's your general?
Yep.
That's
Yeah,
what I
pretty
always do.
much. Yeah, usually so like today I spent most of the day writing workouts for my athletes, and then I'll text each of them and say, hey, like, looking ahead to next week, I see you've got this on the calendar, or hey, I saw that this went well this week, but this thing, maybe you missed this, like, everything okay? I had an athlete text me out of the blue today. They said, hey, I just got out of the ER with dehydration and something else. She's supposed to have a race tomorrow. She's like, yeah, I'm probably gonna make a call on the race um, this afternoon. I was like, oh, wait, what? Maybe no. Maybe let's not race. That doesn't sound. And I asked them, I was like, what? How did this happen? And they're like, I don't know. It's just all of a sudden I was at work with a patient and I had to lay down and somebody took me to the ER. Okay.
Goodness gracious.
Yeah. So I don't know if it's something to do with the heat or what that we're experiencing here in Michigan right now, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, so that kind of ties onto this. The I had to go to a walk-in emergency clinic because I was acutely dehydrated, but I wasn't severely dehydrated. What occurred was, I think I told you this. I've been in a long caloric deficit, and I'd kind of been
Oh yeah.
like flirting with the line, and I kind of was like looking at my performance variables, and it was like still getting a little better. So I was like, it was an aggressive call, and I just kept extending in a week by week, and then the straw that broke the camel's back was I forgot to take my water to basketball, so I got like
Mm,
mildly to moderately dehydrated, but I was so redlined essentially that
hmm.
like my right eye looked like I was underwater.
Oh
And
my
then
gosh.
my heart rate was like 130 sitting. It was wild. Yeah. But we bumped up to maintenance calories for like 3 weeks, and we deloaded for 10 days. And yeah, I think I coined the phrase during that time that I'm pretty sure 3,400 calories could fix bullet holes. The first thing I ate was like a full Domino's pizza and a ice cream sandwich, and it
An,
was delightful.
an entire pizza for yourself.
Yes, it was thin crust to be
Nice.
fair, but
Well,
so then this kind of ties into the same thing though. Like, but how does your sport work with the fitness fatigue paradigm? So that being like, to some degree, fatigue is always going to mask fitness and your ability to be the most prepared for your sport. So like in resistance training, as you're pushing the volume up and up over the course of the mesocycle, fatigue starts to accumulate, and it is likely kind of exponential, to the point where you might have only gained like a couple reps at the end of a 4 week mesocycle, and then you deload, drop that fatigue, and you come back to it, and you realize actually you can add 10 more pounds onto the bar now because that fatigue isn't now masking your performance. So how does that work in the aerobic side of things, like fatigue masking
That's
performance and training variables and things like that?
Yeah, I actually just had a call with an athlete today who was talking about how they just don't feel great right now. And I can't tell you how many times I've gone into a race and felt awful. I was talking to another athlete about they're running their first marathon tomorrow, and they were like, yeah, like in training, I'm just not feeling great right now. And I remember before my first marathon, the weekend before, I just had it was like a short 6 mile run. I say short in quotes. I know, like for maybe a lot of the audience and a lot of your
Hey,
world,
leave me out of this.
6 miles. 6 miles is an eternity. But
I
I
can't
had a six
recall the
mile
last time
run.
I've ran 6 miles.
Yeah,
I
if
played
ever.
I played soccer no, I've definitely done it.
Okay,
I
yeah.
played soccer growing up, and the coaches didn't know how to coach. So even though I was a defender, the whole team just like the camp was like, all right, we're gonna run 1 billion miles. It's like, shouldn't the defenders maybe run a little more sprints? Nope.
Yeah. No. Anyway, yeah. So I had 6 mile run with 3 miles in the middle at my goal marathon pace, and I couldn't hit even 3 miles at my goal marathon pace. And then the next weekend, I went out and ran even faster than my goal marathon
What did you do
pace.
differently?
Um, it was just like the taper, right? Like, so kind of like we're talking about the fatigue of the previous week masking where the fitness was really at. So in the taper, you're drastically reducing volume, maintaining intensity,
Hmm.
but not running nearly the same amount of
Yep.
volume. And so just sharpening. But yeah, one of my favorite quotes is feelings don't dictate outcomes, because in endurance sport, even even at some of my races where I'll race back to back days, like I have an Olympic triathlon on Saturday and a sprint distance triathlon on Sunday, you always feel like trash on Sunday, but somehow I'm able to still pull out good performances. And I think that feelings don't dictate outcomes is a really, like, one of my favorite quotes, because you can feel awful but still perform well, despite the circumstances. Um, and I don't know if it ever feels the same for you in your world, but a lot of times it just feels like, yeah, okay, my legs are heavy, but I can push through it.
Hmm.
Whereas, in your world, maybe you are like physically limited. I think in endurance sport, that's the central governor theory, right?
Yep.
Where you have this central governor that is governing how fast you can go. You can actually like turn that down. And so it's more of a mental game than it is a physical game at points. I know there have been endurance athletes who literally run so hard, so fast, so far, and end up blacking out as soon as they cross the finish line, or maybe even you know 50 yards before the finish line, because they're pushing themselves so hard. And I don't know that that ever happens in strength training. I mean, I know people black out, but it's more
Yeah.
so like the vasovagal response, right? Not necessarily like from their brain literally shutting down.
Yeah. So if there's central fatigue involved, or if the local muscle is not recovered, the bar just doesn't move. Like, so it becomes
Yeah.
pretty objective for us in the sense that, like, okay, last week we got this for 8 reps. We know for this week at the same reps in reserve or repetitions from failure, we want to get at least 9. And if it doesn't one time, that's a yellow flag. If it happens back to back times, that's a red flag, and we're looking at things. Um, yeah, so then like week to week, what is something that would occur like that? Like, okay, you're training someone in endurance sport and you're accruing volume during this time, so like volume progressions week to week. What's something that you get at the end of a week and you look at and you're like, this is sus, this is a yellow flag, or
Yeah.
this is a red flag? Like, walk through that.
Yeah. Heart rate is the main thing that I would look at, heart rate versus pace. So if it was an easy run and their heart rate was supposed to be at 130 for running at 9 minute pace, but instead the heart rate was 140 for 9 minute pace, and it wasn't due to the weather or terrain or anything like that, I'd be like, hey, what's going on? Like, let's, try to keep the heart rate down, right? And then they might tell me, oh yeah, I didn't sleep well last night or fatigued or whatever. But it's usually just heart rate and perceived exertion because I don't monitor really anything else like heart rate, pace, perceived exertion. I'm just communicating with my athletes because it's not, there's really nothing else that I can measure. And so that's kind of like the yellow and red flag, really depending on how far outside that heart rate range they are. And if it's like way outside, if they were at 170 instead of 130, I would kind of go back and look at the graph and see, was this heart rate reading actually accurate? Were they using the chest strap, or was it just on the watch
Hmm.
reading from the wrist? Because the wrist based heart rate is not always super accurate.
Is it precise?
So yeah, no, not
So it's not
the
even
wrist is not.
precise.
Well, it depends. Some people it works, some it doesn't. Some, like even mine, sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't. And it's just kind of random. But on the heart rate graph, you can usually tell because there will be like a spike and then it just stays at the same heart rate the entire time instead of, minor fluctuations depending on increases in speed or elevation or things like that. Um, so yeah, I think Eastern Michigan did a study on the heart rate monitor in the wrist based watches,
Hmm.
and some wrist based watches perform better than others. I mean, there are so many different kinds. You can get Polar, Garmin, Cor- Coros. So there are just so many different ones that all have their own unique, I don't know, algorithm or whatever for measuring heart rate. I guess they use the little sensors on the back. It's kind of like
Yeah.
a pulse oximeter
Yeah.
almost, but unless it's, if it's not cinched down on your wrist super tight, then some light can get in through there
Yep.
and the heart rate might not be accurate. So I look at those things to see, like, was this a true heart rate reading? I talk to my athlete and go, how did that feel? Did it feel okay? And they're like, yeah, I was talking, having a conversation the entire time. And then I'm like, okay, well, maybe the heart rate reading wasn't accurate. So yeah, primarily it's heart rate, perceived exertion, and pace. And there's a cool little the app that I use, the program that I use has, like how did you feel on a scale of 1 to 10, and they can select like the smiley face or the frowny face
Frowning
depending on
face.
how
I'm
they
running.
felt. Yeah, right. So yeah, it's usually those combination of those three factors that I look at when determining, you know, if somebody is hitting their numbers or not for the week.
What What is your resting heart rate? Do you know?
My resting heart rate,
Mm-hmm.
let's see, on average for the last 7 days, 43.
Gosh, you're so out of shape.
I know. The lowest I ever saw it was 29. I was at my cabin in Canada in the middle of nowhere, just relaxing, just like laying down, sitting in the couch, looking at the lake. And I was like, I wonder what my heart rate is right now. And I looked and it was 29, and I got real excited and it started to increase. So, but
That's awesome.
for that brief moment, it was 29, and I was like, wow, that's like once every 2 seconds that my heart is beating. That's kind of scary.
I never paid attention to it, obviously, like growing up. But I'm in the 60s now, and I'm pretty confident that it'll be the first time in my life I'm in the 60s because like even when I was playing a lot of soccer, um, like growing up, I was very much the athlete that wouldn't do any like dedicated training. I would
Mm,
go to the practices and bust those out, but I always had the hardest time with any type of running. Like I was a bigger person. I was overweight, but then in high school I was just like large. Probably I was 6'3" at that time, but I was probably always flirting at like the 20% body fat mark. So like just doing like laps for me and stuff like that was hard. Like I was always much slower than other people in that regard, easier out of breath. But I'm pretty confidently that I can say that this is the best shape I've ever been in. I'm touching the 60s, and I'm just thinking like you'd probably go to the hospital if you're in the 60s.
yeah, that would be alarmingly high.
Yeah.
Or I would know that I was sick. I will say, I had pneumonia back in February, like from the beginning of February to the beginning of March. And when I first started feeling really, really bad, my resting heart rate was like in the 80s. And I was sleeping 4 hours a night because I was just up so often coughing.
Mm.
And so, yeah, little things like that you can use to monitor, an athlete's readiness. Um, it's pretty easy to identify if their resting heart rate, or working heart rate is higher than normal. That the readiness score might not be primed for a workout.
The we're running up on time, but then this is the last one that this is completely out of left field.
Okay.
You were the first person that broached the idea to me that shin splints aren't always about compressive force, that sometimes it's
Mm-hmm.
about how the tendon interacts on the bones through
Mm-hmm.
like contraction. Because I couldn't figure out why that like the question that I had at one point was like, does the resistance training could that make the shin splints worse just because it's more work through the area? And that was what I experienced was the just adding tib raises and stuff like that. The volume and the tension on the bone actually made it worse. And I noticed that still, like I'll get like it's never fully shin split symptoms, but I'll notice that if I make a big volume jump in tib raises, that it's annoyed like a little bit while there's still like a big pump in my tibialis anterior for a little bit. But the inverse is also true, and I want to know if this is true in your experience that I also get a lot of positive benefits, and I don't have shin splint symptoms, but like when I get like weird discomfort, like pre shin splint symptoms, um, daily stretching of my calf
Mm.
specifically, it alleviates it immediately. Like if I notice it feels just a little wonky, 2 sets, 30 seconds, calf stretch, standing, completely gone. I don't know if you had anything more
Yeah,
thoughts on that.
I I've never had shin splints, fortunately. But I have had like calf and Achilles and plantar fascia issues, and I do calf stretches like literally every day. I kind of have to just with my running form, and I'm more of a forefoot runner, so it places more stress and tension on the plantar fascia and the Achilles when you're running in the mid or the forefoot rather than like heel striking.
Okay. I'm a heel
Um,
striker.
yeah, but yeah, so every time before and after a run, I will stretch my plantar fascia, not my plantar fascia, my calf and my soleus, just to keep things loose and prevent them from, getting too tight. But I typically do more dynamic stretches than static
Mm,
stretches. I rarely ever do static stretching. Um, and so I can't speak to that helping with them, but like if it works for you, I would keep doing it. There's got
yeah.
to be some mechanism behind why it's working for you, even if it's just a placebo effect, right? Like we know that the placebo
Yeah.
effect is a real thing. So even if it doesn't actually do anything for you, it is doing something. So keep doing it.
Yeah, well, that's why I brought up the how the tendons interact on that bone right there because I think that's what I'm experiencing. Like I think either if through volume of training of exercise, those muscles are getting a little bit tight and kind of just causing that tendon to interact or be a little bit
Hmm.
fussy on the bone. Just kind of getting a nice stretch in there and telling it to like chill out a little bit.
Right. Well,
Yeah,
and yeah, and stretching the calf because you're stretching the antagonist muscle to the tibialis anterior, like that could help relieve some of the tension in the anterior portion of the leg, I guess. So
yeah.
yeah.
And I started training calves essentially to specifically with a tendon strengthening protocol because I was noticing with all the basketballs playing that my Achilles was like annoyed and I was like, I'm not breaking this thing. So that's been amazing. And then shin splints and I started doing tib work. So like I do a lot of lower limb stuff. I'm actually
Hmm.
getting a nice set of calves on me only through wanting to play more basketball.
That's funny. Hey, if you become a runner, you'll get really good calves, let me tell you.
No.
No, one more thing that I didn't mention earlier when we were talking about was I think a point that you brought up was really important that not a lot of people really understand is like when you do a workout, you're actually going from baseline and you're dropping down. Like doing the workout actually makes you worse.
Worse. Yep.
So I think a lot of people are like, oh yeah, I'm going to get so much more fit from doing this workout. And that's not how it works. You actually get less fit from doing a workout because whether it's lifting or running or biking or whatever it is, you are decreasing the body's, I don't know what the word I'm looking for. You're tearing the muscle fibers. You're preventing yourself from being at maximal capability, right? So like you said, you're baseline and then you drop down, but it's in the recovery that you come back to to baseline or above baseline. That's what makes you better is your
Yep.
recovery, not the workout itself. And so I thought that was a really good point that you brought up, and a point that a lot of people I think miss because they think that the workout itself is making them better when in fact it's making them worse. It's the recovery that makes them better. So
I
I thought that
always
was really
hate like the work harder motivational stuff because it's like
mm-hmm.
how do you know that like I'm not working a good amount? If I were to work harder, I'd start overtraining or like outwork your
Yeah,
opponents. Like, what if that is just too much for me or things like that? So I always say work the appropriate amount and out recover your opponents.
yeah, out recover. I like that one.
Yeah.